This video shows how to install Duralast loaded strut assemblies in the front and rear of this 2007 Lexus RX 350. With a loaded strut assembly, you don't have to take the assembly apart to get to the strut. Instead of taking the old assembly out and compressing a spring to remove the strut, you just put in this whole new assembly. It's a new strut mount, insulator, dust boot, new coil spring, and the strut itself. With the loaded strut assembly, that's all in one piece. Now you can do this job at home with hand tools. For this job, you'll need a 1/2-inch torque wrench. You can borrow this from AutoZone through the Loan-A-Tool program. 30mm 12-point socket is also available through Loan-A-Tool. 1/2-inch breaker bar, 1/2-inch ratchet, 3/8 extension. Now we'll need some 3/8 sockets, 14mm deep, 12mm deep, and a 10mm deep. We'll also be working with some 1/2-inch sockets, 22mm, 21mm, and 19mm. We'll need a screwdriver, a punch, a 6mm Allen wrench, 5mm Allen wrench, a mallet, and a few combo wrenches, 22mm, 19mm, 17mm, and 14mm. You also want to make sure you have a 3/8 ratchet, a magnet, and of course some safety gloves and glasses. Now we'll be working under the car, so you'll need a strong hydraulic jack, some jack stands, wheel chocks, and an engaged parking brake. Start by breaking the lug nuts with a breaker bar and 21mm socket. Jack up the car and put it securely on jack stands. Finish removing the lug nuts and take the wheel off. On this vehicle, the strut assembly's top nuts are under this access panel. We're just going to pull off the access panel for more wiggle room. Now loosen the top nuts with a 14mm deep socket. Now go into the wheel well and remove the clip holding the wheel speed sensor. Use a 12mm socket with an extension to remove the clip holding the brake line to the strut. Remove the sway bar link with a 6mm Allen and 17mm wrench. Loosen and remove the nut and set the link to the side. You may want to spray some PV Blaster on the axle nut to help break it. Use a 30mm 12-point socket with a 1/2-inch breaker bar to break the axle nut loose. Then loosen and remove the axle nut. We're going to knock the axle loose from the hub with a mallet and a punch. Now you can break loose and then remove the two bottom bolts from the strut assembly with a 22mm socket. You may need to use the mallet and punch to encourage these bolts out. Now hold the assembly in place while removing the top nuts. Then remove the assembly. Get the new assembly and install it. Install the top nuts to hold the assembly in place and tighten. Install the bottom bolts on the new assembly. Ratchet the bottom nuts onto the bottom bolts. Install the axle nut. Torque spec on the axle nut is 217 foot-pounds. Reattach the brake line bracket. Reattach the wheel speed sensor. Put the wheel back on and partially tighten the lug nuts. Jack up the car and remove the stands. Lower the car until it's barely touching the ground and then tighten the lug nuts. Repeat this on the other side before moving to the rear. To install assemblies on the rear of the vehicle, break the lug nuts, jack up the car, remove the lug nuts and the wheel following the same process as we did on the front. Now you'll need to go inside the back to remove an access panel and get to the top nuts on the strut assembly. Since the car is raised, be careful when removing the panel and the nuts. Use a 14mm ratchet with an extension to loosen and remove the nuts through the access panel. You could use a magnet to take the nuts out easily. Down in the wheel well, remove the wheel speed sensor with a 10mm socket and the brake line bracket with a 12mm socket. Remove the sway bar link with a 5mm Allen and 14mm combo wrench. Break the bottom bolts on the assembly with a 19mm socket and remove the nuts. Remove the bottom nuts and then take out the bolts. If they are stuck or corroded, you can use a mallet and a punch or some PV Blaster to help. Now remove the assembly and install the new assembly. Push the assembly into place and attach one top nut to hold it there. Again, you want to be careful with the interior while the car is raised. You may need a second person to hold the assembly in place and do this job safely. Use a magnet and a ratchet with an extension to install and tighten all 3 top bolts. Now you can replace the 2 large bottom bolts. Install the 2 bottom bolts and tighten. Install the sway bar link. Reattach the brake line and the wheel speed sensor. Install the wheel following the same procedure that we did on the front. Repeat this process on the other side, and you're done. It's a good idea to go for a test drive and get an alignment check to make sure everything's working properly. Enjoy your new suspension.